would be room for only one. Next, Harley-Davidson versus Indian. The great rumble of the American road. Winner takes all. Harley-Davidson and Indian. In the motorcycle world, they were Coke and Pepsi, Yankees and Dodgers, Hatfields and McCoys. The rivalry launched 1,000 tattoos and at least one poem.
You'll never wear out the Indian Scout or its brother, the Indian Chief. They're built like rocks to take hard knocks. It's the Harleys that cause the grief.
And the reply from the Harley faithful says you.
The fellow downstairs had a Harley-Davidson, and one day I said to him, "What kind of a motorcycle is that?" He said, "It's a Harley-Davidson," and then he sort of grabbed me by the shirt, and he pulled me right up close, and he said, "Don't ever buy an Indian."
But if two old motorcycle companies commanded such loyalty, why did one fail dismally and the other become a runaway American success story? And why did one of the loveliest designs of the 20th century disappear from the American highway? Wasn't there enough room in America for both Harley and Indian?
The two makes became the rivals, and they were rivals in racing. They were rivals in sales. Now, as it happened, the actual founding fathers were not enemies.
In those less culturally sensitive times, the founders of Indian were called the Big Chief and the Medicine Man. Big Chief George Hendy was a former champion bicycle racer. Medicine Man Oscar Hedstrom was a whiz at engine design. Between 1902 and 1914, Hendy and Hedstrom built the world's biggest motorcycle company in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Indian was the innovator. Indian set some speed records in America, and the Europeans, as they usually do, laughed. And so they sent a couple of Indians over to England, and they finished 1-2 in the Isle of Man races.
A distant second in sales was the Harley-Davidson Motor Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The company began producing a reliable single-cylinder bike in 1903. But it wasn't until 1909 that they really hit their stride with the 45-degree V-twin.
You can look at that bike today and you can see in 2002 where that bike has come. There's a direct lineage between that V-twin and the V-twins of today.
But then, the nature of the rivalry abruptly changed, due in part to another tragedy at the Motordrome. In 1912, top Indian rider Jake DeRosier was gravely injured on the board track. After that, it said, Oscar Hedstrom lost his taste for motorcycling. The day of DeRosier's funeral, Hedstrom retired from Indian. Big Chief George Hendy soon followed. The rivalry was now between a corporation, Indian, and a family business, Harley-Davidson. During the 1920s, Harley and Indian matched each other bike for bike. But the companies were worlds apart. Harley-Davidson was driven by a hard-nosed business ethic. Indian was hobbled by mismanagement in the boardroom, pilferage on the factory floor.
They were stealing the plant blind. There were guys just carrying stuff off from the plant, and the Indian plant in Springfield. So the company's in big trouble. So E. Paul comes in here and buys control of Indian.
E. Paul DuPont bought Indian in 1929. Heir to the DuPont paint dynasty, he was also a motorcycle enthusiast. For the first time in over a decade, Indian was run by a gentleman biker.
He brought a motorcycle ethic to the company, and he knew how to run companies. The files are full of handwritten notes that he wrote to the engineers. You know, rode the new Scout, not happy with the power band, the brakes, the whatever. What can we do?
Indian was back, though now in second place. And Harley was developing the machine that would keep them there. By 1936, it was ready. The EL model with the Art Deco lines and two-fisted rocker boxes on the engine, which was soon to be known as the Knucklehead. The real innovation was between those knuckles. Older Harley and Indian engines were called flatheads, or side valves, because the valves were beside the piston. Rotating the valves to a position over the piston heads allows for higher compression and better engine breathing.
And breathing in an engine is the key to making horsepower. The more it breathes, the more gas and air you can put in, the more power it makes.
For the first time in the long rivalry, Indian had no comparable bike. But there was life in the old company yet. In 1940, Indian unveiled a motorcycling classic. It came from the school of streamline design. Streamlining was the art of making objects look fast while they were standing still. For the 1940 model year, Indian designer Briggs Weaver achieved the effect on a motorcycle.
Probably the single most distinctive shape in motorcycling, starting out with the front fender, the fully valenced fender, the Indian Chief running light, the chrome moto lamp headlight. It just sort of set the whole streamlined tone for the rest of the bike. And then you've got this sort of teardrop-shaped flowing rear fender that complements the front fender. It really is, to many people's eyes, probably the best looking of the Indian Chiefs.
Yet to many bikers of the day, that gorgeous sheet metal was just excess baggage.
Any Indian restorer will tell you that thousands of them were thrown away and stacked up behind Indian dealerships, and mechanics who worked on them at the time were constantly taking them off and throwing them away.
But the coming of World War II soon halted production of all civilian vehicles. The rivalry was now for military contracts. For the Army, Harley-Davidson developed a 750cc V-twin. Indian came up with a 500cc bike. Not exactly a fair fight.
The Army called for a 500cc bike. Harley built a 750. Indian played by the rules and built a 500cc bike that was pretty underpowered compared to the Harley. So Harley came out of the war in better shape than Indian.
Harley had produced 88,000 military bikes. Indian, fewer than 40,000. Yet after the war, Indian made one last daring play to steal Harley's thunder. E. Paul DuPont left Indian in 1945. He was succeeded by 36-year-old Ralph Rogers, a man with a vision to revolutionize American motorcycling. Right after the war, everybody wanted wheels. If you couldn't get a car, you wanted a bike. Problem was, as Rogers thought, you might be intimidated by one of the old-fashioned road burners.
He was not swayed by the romance of the big road-going Chief. He realized that these were old designs that had their roots in the 20s and 30s.
In 1949, Indian introduced the motorcycle line intended to put every American on two wheels. There was a single-cylinder Indian Arrow and a redesigned Scout with a British-style vertical twin engine. The new Indians were hyped by the celebrities of the day: Cary Grant, Robert Ryan, and football star Bobby Waterfield and wife Jane Russell took photo ops aboard the new Indians. The marketing might have been sound, but the bikes were not. They were badly under-engineered and plagued by electrical failures. The new model line sat in mostly empty showrooms.
And the dealers came in begging, threatening. I'm told they had to be locked, they had to lock the boardroom because these guys were out there beating on the door saying, bring us the motorcycles we can sell.
Indian shut down the new model line in 1952. They continued making just one bike, the shapely but outdated Chief, until 1953. Then, the doors quietly closed on the old Wigwam, as the Springfield factory was called. The building was demolished in 1984. Ralph Rogers has been vilified as the man who killed Indian, but his vision for the future of motorcycles was sound.
This was the idea ahead of its time, because what Rogers did in 1949 was exactly what Mr. Honda did in 1959. But of course, Honda's timing was better, and Honda's product was indescribably better.
Indian's day was done. Harley-Davidson was in sole command of the field. But the old rivalry between Milwaukee and Springfield has never quite died. Just ask a couple of partisan bikers, as Peter Egan did.
And I said, what was that Indian Harley thing all about? And the Indian guy said, well, that's easy. He said, Indian riders could read and Harley owners were the scum of the earth. And of course, the Harley guy thought it was the other way around.
Next, two sides of the law, one motorcycle. Harley-Davidson in the 1960s, from cop bike to radical custom. Back in the 60s, two things were guaranteed to make your hands tremble on the steering wheel. One, a motorcycle cop in your rearview mirror. And two, an outlaw biker on his chopped hog. And chances are, both these riders would have saddled up on the same brand.
It's very interesting how Harley-Davidson strides both sides of an interesting cultural divide in America. On the one hand, you've got cops on Harleys. And on the other side, you've got the bad boys on Harleys, the Hells Angels and so on.
Stranger yet, they might literally have ridden the same bike.
Since most of those bikes were probably bought in an auction, I wonder how many motor officers in the 60s, have pulled over a guy that's riding a chopped out bike that used to be theirs, that he used to bust people on.
So why did both policeman and biker ride Harley-Davidson? And how could the same machine play the dual role of cop bike and chopper? This rare film was shot for Easy Riders magazine in 1978. It shows two original members of the notorious Booze Fighters Motorcycle Club riding their Harleys from LA to Sturgis, South Dakota. The Booze Fighters are credited with kickstarting the outlaw biker movement in 1947. But the outlaw heritage goes back even further.
The term outlaw